Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Just a quick reminder that you can support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up either A Popular History of Unpopular Things or APHOUT, APHOUT. And you can also now watch episodes on YouTube. So if that's you right now, go subscribe, hit the button right below. I appreciate all the love and support. So throughout history, there have been times where there were panics. The most well known would probably be the witch hunts that began in the early 15th century, that's the 1400s, and continued through to 1775. During this time, over 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft, and anywhere from 40 to 60,000 of them were executed. Now, this witch hunt panic spilled over into the Americas. Remember the Salem witch trials, right? I did an episode on that a few years back. Good stuff. And there was also a vampire panic in New England when consumption, which is really just tuberculosis, was killing off people in Rhode Island. I did an episode on that too, so go check them out if you haven't already. So, would you believe me if I told you that there was also a werewolf panic? Now, beginning in the 15th century, that's the 1400s, there was a combined panic over both witches and werewolves. Those accused were put on trial, which really meant that they were being tortured into a confession and then executed in bloody and violent ways. So today, I want to talk about one specific suspected werewolf known as the Werewolf of Bedburg. As we usually do here on the AFOUT podcast, we'll start with the historical context. What was going on in Europe that explains why the people were panicked about werewolves? What did this have to do with witches? And did the idea of a werewolf look the same all across Europe? And after we get a good understanding of the werewolf situation in Europe, we'll focus on one man in particular named Peter Stumpp, a 50-year-old farmer who confessed to being a werewolf in Bedburg, Germany. It's going to be real juicy today. Lots of blood and gore and violence and torture and cannibalism, my favorite. So let's get started. If you've listened to any of my other podcast episodes, you know that I am a big fan of context. It's just as important to understand the history surrounding a topic to get a better sense of what's going on and why it happened. So, to better understand Peter Stumpp's execution as a werewolf, we need to talk about the world that he lived in. As I mentioned in the intro, there was a general panic over all things supernatural: witches, vampires, and werewolves. Why? Where did this fear come from, and why that specific period of time? What was happening in Europe that made people turn on each other and accuse them of things like witchcraft or shapeshifting? So, I've done a lot of episodes that take place in this period of European history, what we typically call the early modern period. There was a lot going on. The European trading city on the edge of Asia, Constantinople, fell in 1453. It's kind of the beginning of the early modern period. And as a result, there were a lot of religious, political, and economic tensions. Where would my Eastern goods come from? I used to get them trading through Constantinople, but that's gone now, right? Do I need to worry about the spread of Islam even further into Europe? So then we started exploring other routes to Asia to get our stuff, which culminated, of course, with Columbus sailing west and connecting Europe to the Americas. And this led to a lot of political and economic changes. New technologies also hasten change in Europe. I've previously mentioned in other episodes Johann Gutenberg's printing press, right? Adapted from East Asian inventions, changed the face of literacy and reading and books and print forever. People started reading the Bible for the first time, reading it for themselves instead of listening to their Catholic priests, and they came up with their own interpretations of Christianity. Cue the Protestant Reformation and massive splits in the Catholic Church. Now, these are changes that took place over a long period of time, sure, but consider that they would have been huge interruptions to daily life. Just consider Germany in the early 1500s. They're split up into small principalities ruled by different houses, but are all generally considered to be part of the Holy Roman Empire. But there's war and conflict between them all, and between the HRE in general and other European countries. So then you've got these different principalities fighting over which Christian faith they want to follow. Maybe you were once Catholic, but now you're living in a Protestant village, or vice versa. Life around you is just different. And there's all these new inventions coming in, and people are literate now, and they're spouting their own ideas about things, and the pace of life is just changing. I mean, think about today. Think about how rapidly our world is changing because of technology. For those of you old enough to remember, so my fellow millennials and up, our childhoods looked vastly different from Gen Z and Gen Alpha, right? Sure, some of us might have had old video game consoles, but it is nothing compared to the iPad babies out there now. And that's not a slam, it's just fact. Our childhoods were different from their childhoods because of the availability of technology. New technology hastens change, rapid change, and that often leads to conflict and fear. Consider the new developing AI technologies, right? Think about how much fear there's out there. People are looking for a place to vent their frustrations and distrust of this new, potentially scary thing. So think of the witch and werewolf panics like that. The world was changing rapidly around them, and the people looked to a scapegoat for why life was so different now. The easiest thing to do was to blame someone for something, and that's why we see people being accused of things like witchcraft or shapeshifting. So now that we have a better sense of the panic and general insecurity of the early modern period in Europe, why werewolves? What did werewolves look like for an early modern European? And where did the idea of a werewolf come from anyway? Was it new? So, no, actually, as it turns out, werewolves go back a long time in our cultural history. Werewolves appeared in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian epic poem from around 2100 BCE. Maybe some of you guys had to read it in school. They also existed in Greek mythology, so the idea of man turning into beasts has been around for a long time. And at the tail end of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern period, werewolves were blamed alongside witches for things like crop failures or infertility, bodily ailments, dead livestock. A mutilated cattle would be blamed on a werewolf's hunger. And logically, werewolf accusations only took place in areas that still had wolves, because it was actually the wolves doing the killing. England, for example, had no record of werewolf trials because there haven't been wolves in England since the late 1400s, early 1500s. So we can't actually blame the homeland on this one, just continental Europe. So if a cow ended up mutilated and chewed up on a field, right, it's going to be the wolf. The wolf did it. But why blame a wolf when we can make it spicy and blame a werewolf? So who was accused of being a werewolf then? Well, it was usually someone who shepherded animals, which kind of makes sense, right? Oh, if a wolf is going around killing animals, then blame would fall on the person responsible for those animals. And though there were some cases of women being accused of being a werewolf, it was mostly men. Werewolves were seen as strong and violent and bloodthirsty and aggressive, which are usually traits, at least back then, attributed to men. Women were more often labeled as witches, but men could be witches too. So here's a fun side story before we get to Peter Stumpp. It's about a wolf that terrorized rural France between 1764 and 1767. The Beast of Gévaudan. And I'm probably saying that wrong because I don't do French. Gévaudan. Put it up on the screen. Gévaudan. It's French though, so you probably skip half the letters. No, anyway, this wolf was attacking people, around 100 men, women, and children, which is pretty intense for a wolf, to be honest. I imagine we were probably encroaching on a wolf pack's lands and it was attacking out of fear, because that's usually what wolves do. And it was probably a whole pack of wolves, not one singular wolf. But anyway, most people, both contemporary to the times and modern scholars today, believed that it really was just wolves doing this. Most people back then thought it was wolves. But there's also a rumor going around that it was actually a werewolf. the beast, right? Now, it even got to a point where King Louis XV of France sent hunters out to find and kill it. And there was a pretty hefty bounty on the wolf's head. For those of you not comfortable with the French monarchy, it was after the son King Louis XIV who kind of made Versailles popular and huge, but before King Louis XVI who had his head chopped off during the French Rev. It's the one in the middle. He was really into women. So, this bounty, this werewolf, this beast, it made news all across Europe and even made its way over to the United States. You can imagine how badly the description was warped, though. One report says, quote, "It has a snout somewhat like a calf's and very long hair, which would seem to indicate a hyena." Now, another source said, quote, "It could walk on its hind feet, and its hide could repel bullets, and it had fire in its eyes, and it came back from the dead more than once, and had amazing leaping ability." So clearly, people were making this wolf or pack of wolves out to be more supernatural than what it was. The beast apparently killed, or rather, apparently was killed in June of 1767. And if we take a step back and look at this story in context, it tells us that the fear of werewolves, the occult, the supernatural was still very much present in Europe. And a werewolf was used to explain the unexplainable. But this happened well after the peak years of the werewolf trials in Europe. By the end of the 17th century, that's the 1600s, werewolf trials had died down tremendously. So the Beasts of Givaudan, which again I'm saying wrong, which happened well after the peak years of the werewolf panic, was really just another expression of fear. The French people were going through the 7 Years' War, and things in France were a little dicey. So when people in rural southern France start dying, they turn that fear to the supernatural. It must be werewolves targeting us. It was an escape of sorts, a way to pin the blame on someone. So, with all that in mind, let's get to the main story of today's podcast, the Werewolf of Bedburg. Does this have any similarity to the beast in France? How does this connect with the context of the time? Was Peter Stumpp just a scapegoat for the fears people had? A manifestation of the uncertainty of the times? Let's find out. On Halloween of 1589, because of course it was on Halloween, in Bedburg, Germany, Peter Stumpp was executed. He was charged with multiple murders, cannibalism, how do I put this? Fornication with a succubus, and apparently even his own daughter. Jesus Christ. Now, he was strapped to a breaking wheel and skinned with hot pincers, ripping little pieces of his flesh off. And once he was completely flayed, his limbs were broken on the wheel. I've been over the breaking wheel in a couple of episodes, but that's essentially the point. You feed the person's limbs through the spokes of the wheel and break them. Breaking wheel. Once he was completely devoid of skin and his limbs were broken, he was then decapitated. And then his body was burned at the stake. Just imagine, if you will, what that must have looked like. A flayed, headless body tied to a stake, set on fire. The head was then affixed to a spike carved in the shape of a wolf and displayed as a warning to others not to conspire with the devil. Because that is what Peter Stumpp claimed he had done. He confessed to making a deal with the devil to turn into a werewolf. He confessed to killing 16 people, 13 of which were children, including his own children. He confessed to eating his son's own brain. And after confessing to all these crimes, he was more or less tortured to death. So immediately, my brain goes to, okay, but did he really? Right? Or was he just tortured until he confessed? What really happened here? I mean, obviously he's not a werewolf, right? But was he a mass murderer and deviant? Was he a cannibal? Or did he just say that he did those things? So the first thing we need to do as historians in this situation is to look at primary source records. What records exist that were published at the time of the trial that detail what actually happened? Can we read through them, take a step back, look at the bigger picture, and figure out the real story? Well, only kind of, actually. Because the historical record here is pretty sparse. Apparently, printed accounts of this trial were all over Europe, but those records are just gone, lost to time, missing, poof. There are some records that still exist, like a 16-page pamphlet published in London in 1590, which is currently housed, by the way, at the British Library. And this English language document is apparently a translation of the original German one, which makes sense as it was a German werewolf trial, but the original German document is gone. Now, what's really cool about this English pamphlet, at least, is that it has illustrations of Stumpp as a werewolf too, with different panels showing his capture and trial and execution. I love old manuscripts illustrations, they're great. If you ever see medieval rocket cats, those are really cool. Now, here's what we know about Peter Stumpp from this fragmented record that still exists. I read through the text of the source myself, which I found online on Early English Books Online, which is provided by the libraries of the University of Michigan. It is a great resource, and I appreciate the people who transcribe all of these old sources online for us historians who can't always travel to see them in person. So, thank you for that. So, first, this source, before it even gets into the meat of its story, starts by calling Peter a, quote, most wicked sorcerer. So, right off the bat, we know that this is tied up with the general witch panic of the early modern period that I mentioned earlier. He was accused of being a werewolf, but really, that was an extension of engaging in witchcraft and making a pact with the devil. And tangential fun fact, werewolves in Eastern Europe in the early modern period were basically akin to vampires, whereas werewolves in Western Europe were tied up with witches and sorcery. So that's pretty neat. I need to do an episode on Vlad the Impaler sometime soon. You know, Dracula. But anyway, the source starts by saying that Peter Stumpp had been practicing wicked arts from 12 years old. It then goes on to claim that he practiced magic, necromancy, and sorcery. If you're not a gamer and or don't know what necromancy is, it's summoning the dead. But listen, that's a pretty bold claim. To say that he's been practicing this stuff since childhood? And here's how the source goes, quote, in the end, he gave both soul and body to the devil forever, for small carnal pleasure in this life, that he might be famous and spoken of on earth, though he lost heaven thereby. The devil, who hath a ready ear to listen to the lewd motions of cursed men, promised to give unto him whatsoever his heart desired during his mortal life. He only requested that at his pleasure he might work his malice on men, women, and children in the shape of some beast. The devil, who saw him a fit instrument to perform mischief as a wicked fiend, pleased with the desire of wrong and destruction. Peter was straight transformed into the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like brands of fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body, and mighty paws. End quote. Very, very descriptive. Almost like it's a fictional pamphlet designed to get people talking and gossiping about the devil and all the evil in the world. Now, the source goes on to describe Peter's evilness and the things he enjoyed doing with his newfound devil-given werewolf powers, which includes plucking out people's throats, tearing their joints asunder, shedding them of blood, butchering children, assaulting women in the fields, and, quote, after his filthy lust fulfilled, he would murder them, end quote. It goes on and on and on. A veritable laundry list of all the evil things they could possibly pin on one man. And then the source gets into his crimes against children specifically. Just a quick warning. This gets really gross and depraved, even for me. This is super gross. The shock factor is pretty high, which was intentional, okay? Intentionally shocking. The source continues, quote, he had murdered 13 young children and 2 goodly young women, big with child, tearing the children out of their wombs in the most bloody and savage sort, and after eat their hearts panting hot and raw. He had at that time living a fair young daughter, after whom he also lusted most unnaturally and cruelly committed most wicked incest with her, a most gross and vile sin, far surmounting adultery or fornication. And such was his inordinate lust and filthy desire toward her that he begat a child by her, daily using her as his concubine, but as a filthy beast, given over to work evil with greediness, he also lay by his own sister. End quote. And I'm going to stop there because it actually gets worse. Now, let's reconsider this source for a second. This is an English translation of a German story about a man who confessed to being a horrible, evil, vile, depraved devil worshiper who asked to become a werewolf so he can do all of this evil stuff that he wants to do. And boy, does this pamphlet sell that idea. They are piling on the most awful and vile things he can think of. He murdered people. No, wait, he murdered children. No, wait, he murdered pregnant women and ate their fetuses. No, wait, I can get worse. He lusted after his own daughter and got her pregnant and... Okay, pamphlet authors, we get it. He's a bad dude. And it goes on and on and on from there, including more stories like how he hunted down his own son and ate his brain. But I'm sitting here in 2024 not too shocked about what he's done, actually. Not because I'm a weirdo who doesn't find this gross. It's gross. But I'm not thinking about this guy doing all this horrible stuff. I'm thinking about what they must have done to Peter Stumpp to get him to confess all of these horrible things. And what did he actually confess to compared to what this pamphlet said he did? And why him? And was any of this actually valid? Was he a mass murderer? And did he do all of these crimes? But it was just easier to understand if they made him a devil worshiper and a werewolf? I want to know more information about that. Well, sources all more or less say, the surviving ones anyway, that Peter Stumpp was a 50-year-old farmer, which means that he was in the fields near where animals would have been killed by wolves, which matches what I said earlier about who was accused of being a werewolf. But since most of the records are gone, we don't really know much more about him and why the people hated him so badly as to accuse him of being a werewolf and all the other awful things, and whether or not he actually killed anyone. Now, according to this English pamphlet, here's how they knew that the killer was Peter Stumpp as a werewolf. So they were trying to catch the wolf, and he'd been killing around 25 years at that point, okay? Women, men, children, and beasts, like livestock, indiscriminately, okay? So the men, quote, set their dogs upon him in such a sort that there was no means to escape, at which advantage they could never get him before. But as the Lord delivered Goliath into the hands of David, so was this wolf brought into the danger of these men, who, seeing, as I said before, no way to escape the imminent danger, being hardly pursued at the heels, presently he slipped his girdle from about him, whereby the shape of a wolf, clean avoided, he appeared presently in his true shape and likeness. End quote. So for anybody who was just glazing over that and not listening because early modern English is rough, he shapeshifted from his wolf form to his human form in front of the hunters chasing after him. So they knew that the Werewolf of Bedburg was really Peter Stumpp the farmer, and he was arrested and put on trial. And then, the source says, and I'm just going to paraphrase now, he was put on the rack, but fearing torture, he voluntarily confessed to all of the things that he did. How he was a sorcerer, how he made a pact with the devil, all things that would shock a good Christian audience. Remember, it's the 16th century. He was put to death in 1589, and religious upheaval is everywhere. With the Protestant Reformation, people are uncertain about their religious beliefs and what they were allowed to practice. It was a touchy subject, which, if I take a step back and look at the bigger picture here, tells me that this really sensational piece about a man who was in leagues with the devil and did all of these horrible, perverse things was just a way for people to express their fears and frustrations about religion and godliness. The source ends with a description of his execution, which matches what I said earlier, so it doesn't bear repeating. But it was pretty bad. It's one of the worst breaking wheel punishments that I've read about. It then reads, just a nail in the coffin here of my interpretation of the source, quote, Thus, gentle reader, have I set down the true discourse of this wicked man, Peter Stumpp, which I desire to be a warning to all sorcerers and witches, which unlawfully follow their own devilish imagination, to the utter ruin and destruction of their souls eternally. From which wicked and damnable practice, I beseech God, keep all good men, and from the cruelty of their wicked hearts. Amen. End quote. And that last paragraph there tells me everything I need to know. This pamphlet, grossly exaggerated and its credibility very dubious, was meant to shock people into following their religion and being good and godly and fearful of anything deemed to be devilry. See what happens when you stray from the path? You make a covenant with the devil and turn into a werewolf, with murder and become a cannibal and do all these horrible things. Was Peter Stumpp a murderer? We don't actually know. But what we do know is that there was a war going on in his region of what would later become Germany from 1583 to 1588. The Cologne War, the region, not the men's perfume, which was a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. Religious tension, remember? This predates the 30 Years' War, by the way, 1618 to 1648, which was another more famous religious conflict in what would later become Germany, over which religion should be practiced in each of the principalities. Stumpp was a recently converted Protestant, but Bedburg had recently been overrun by Catholics. And out of this religious uncertainty, we see cases and situations like Peter Stumpp, scapegoats for what was really going on here, a fear of the unknown and religious turmoil. And as one Nat Geo article put it, quote, Stumpp may have been singled out to ritually purge the community of evil through his execution. Or maybe he was a murderer, but making him a werewolf murderer just sounded cooler in print. But we'll never really know. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Werewolf of Bedburg. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and join as a cannibal, an explorer, or a historian. If you're interested in more content, or you just want to be lovely and support me, then check out my Patreon and subscribe to the AFOUT channel on YouTube. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.